Some years I felt that my best books of the year video ends up telling some kind of a story almost, but I gotta say this year's list is incoherent. Like, this is an unbelievably random stack of books. And I'm not saying that to be like, I mean, I just read so widely, my taste can't be categorized. No, this is what happens when a reading year goes off the rails. The first half of the year, I was finishing my master's, taking classes and writing my thesis, all those sorts of things. And the second half of the year was not my favorite. I might talk about it at some point, but I needed that symbolic turn of the calendar. And since the summer, I've mostly been rereading a ton of books to prep for these newer videos. So instead of a polished presentation here, I think I want to have more of a chat. I want to take you through a relaxed tour of my weird reading year. We're going in no particular order except that I'm saving my top 3 for the end. I'm starting with 3 books that are featured in my recent videos. So I reread all of Jane Austen's novels this year, and I made a video with clearly marked sections so that, for example, if you've only read Emma, you can go watch the Emma section without spoiling any of the others. Although for the most part, it's a non-spoiler video. And actually, my favorite reread was Mansfield Park. It's not my favorite Austen overall, but this time around, I flew through this at a time when I was struggling to read in general. I've already caught some flack for this. I was recently at a baby shower where a family friend was like, "You like Mansfield Park?" No. They're cousins. And I know. I know they're cousins. I acknowledge that. It's not what I would choose were it in my literary power, and this is the least romantic of Austen's books. Giacomo, can you please stop doing whatever you're doing with the cardboard? But I think I made a decent case for it, so I'll link that specific section below if you want to see me defend the gloomy, moralizing cousins book. Buddy, can we take it down a notch? I also put out a video that's a Czech literature starter kit, and I probably didn't think it through. I should have posted it in January, I think, because I myself didn't watch a single YouTube video for well over a week because of the holidays. So if there hasn't been a convenient time for you to watch it yet, I completely get that. But I think it's probably the best YouTube video I've ever made. I take you through 15 Czech books in 30 minutes, 5 classics, 5 post-war titles, and 5 21st century titles. And there really is something for almost everyone on there, even if you don't personally care about Czech Lit. I'll care enough for the both of us. Most of the preparation for that kit involved dipping back into books that I had previously read, but there were a few that were new to me this year, including 2 of the classics, 2 shining stars. I finally read Božena Němcova's The Grandmother, the most influential 19th century Czech novel, and it's a 19th century translation too from a woman named Frances Gregor. Like I said in the kit, this has some serious Little Women vibes to it, but with these sections that have much more of a European romanticism to them and elements of Central European folklore. There's a moment I've been thinking about of this gamekeeper talking about his life in the woods and this specific story of a tree that was cut down and the grief he felt about that. And it's this perfect tension of everyday life and the transformative magic of storytelling. It's beautiful. The other best new to me title was Karel Čapek's 1936 book War with the Newts, translated by Edmund R. Weatherall. And it has no right to be this fun considering the intensity of the subject matter. The Kurt Vonnegut blurb feels very appropriate. If you're a science fiction reader, you might be familiar with Čapek because he's the person who created the term robot in his early 1920s play R.U.R. I've been thinking a lot about how much language of origin plays a role in a person becoming famous beyond their home country. And I know it's a counterfactual, but I have this nagging sense that if Čapek had written in a major language, that he would be as famous as somebody like Jules Verne. Čapek is still read, of course, but not on the level of something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and a lot of his books in other languages are mostly available on the used book market. So it was something special to me to see some people in the comments of the starter kit saying that they now wanted to read War with the Newts. Okay, a book I haven't talked about before is a nonfiction one called Stalin and the Fate of Europe, The Post-War Struggle for Sovereignty by Norman M. Naimark. This came out in 2019. It focuses on the immediate post-war years of 1945 to 49, and Naimark's goal is to show that nothing was preordained about the spheres of influence that emerged in Europe. That Stalin didn't have a specific Iron Curtain plan or geography in mind, and that actually all these different political actors in different European countries had significant choices to make in the post-war era before something like a Cold War was ever a thought. So we get case studies of 7 European countries and of their main figures' interactions with Stalin. There's a nice mixture of some obvious places like Poland and Germany, and then some less obvious ones like Finland. Why wasn't Finland ultimately behind the Iron Curtain? And why hadn't hadn't I thought to ask that before? My favorite thing about this, though, might be a little counterintuitive. It's that it was written by a Stalin scholar, but you would never know it because Naimark is genuinely interested in other countries and their political figures to such an extent that Stalin is mostly a side character. And believe me, historical scholarship about Russia and the Soviet Union is often so dominated by these psychological portraits of the biggest leaders that this format and the realistic agency it grants other people feels really refreshing. I had to read this in about a day for school. It was one of those situations, but my instinct is that it wouldn't work best as a stop and start book. Do you know what I mean? There's some books that you can read 5 to 10 pages at a time and they're still satisfying that way, but then there are others that just work better in slightly longer sections. So if you're interested in this, I think I would recommend trying to read each chapter in 2 to 3 sittings, maybe, because there's a lot going on in each case study. Okay, our next detour, because this whole video is only detours. For the first time in years, I read a novel in Spanish and had a great time. It's called Nada by Carmen Laforet. My Spanish is not what it once was, so I can't really evaluate the language in here the way I could with an English language novel, but the tone of this is so vivid. A tone can't be vivid though, can it? Currently speaking 0 languages properly. This is quite a famous Spanish language novel. It's interesting because it was published in 1945 and it's set directly after the Spanish Civil War. Our protagonist is this girl named Andrea who's excited to go live with her relatives in Barcelona, or Barcelona as the case may be. But she finds her grandmother and aunts and uncles living in this dark and depressing and crumbling house, and they have really odd relationships. The atmosphere of the book is oppressive because Andrea wants to go out in the loosening post-war city and be this freer young woman, but her family still has this sense of rigid morals and what is and is not appropriate for a young woman to do. There's an English translation of this by Edith Grossman, so I feel I can recommend the translation without even reading it. That's how impeccable she was. In a similar vein, the 2 most meaningful books for me this year were Zahrada, or The Garden by Petra Dvořáková, and Ostře, sledované vlaky by Bohumil Hrabal. Zahrada has only been translated from Czech into Polish so far, I think, but Edith Pargeter's English translation of Closely Watched Trains is also on my starter kit. The reason these are here though is that they're the first 2 full-length books that I've ever read in Czech, and the tenacity and utter self-loathing it took to get here is unreal. I have talent, but not genius when it comes to languages. I grew up in a monolingual family, and as an adult, it's all been such a beautiful struggle. I honestly think that's why I was able to randomly read in Spanish again, because after a few years of climbing the vertical cliff face that is Slavic languages, when my brain re-encountered Spanish, it was like, oh, thank God. Anyway, I have a long way to go. I'm still only reading Czech novels slowly and with a dictionary, but given all the lows that are involved in language learning, I did want to stop to take a moment for these highs. Finishing Zahrada especially was such a moment, you know? Baby's first book. As you might have gathered, I don't tend to read that many American classics, and there are some serious gaps in that part of my reading. It's a bit of a sorry not sorry situation, but I would like to keep an eye on it and to fill in some of those gaps. A major American book that I had somehow managed to own for more than half of my life. I'm 32 and I had owned this for almost 17 years, was Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, his 1845 memoir, essentially, of his early life as a slave. So I finally read it in 2024, and wow. There are so many noteworthy qualities of this in terms of its intended audience, the way it was framed in the press and received by the public, the influence it went on to have. But you could say the same about plenty of lesser books, and in my eyes, this is worth reading primarily for Douglass's writing. The way he blends matter-of-fact details of this is who this was, this is how this happened, this was the timeline, with all these striking, almost novelistic moments of deeper and more personal characterizations. It's this interesting combination of detachment and powerful emotion, and he doesn't seem to want to rely too heavily on either. At the end of the day, it's great memoir writing about a horrendously difficult early life. And of course, as extraordinary as Douglass's life experiences went on to be, these early experiences weren't remotely unique, and the force of that hits you as well in the course of this. It's part of his project. So David W. Blight's biography of him has once again risen to the top of my nonfiction TBR. Because pitching books to editors used to be a part of my job, and because I've been a book reviewer, I am programmed while I'm reading to think, okay, so who would I recommend this book to, specifically or generally? In a delightful turn of events, this past year I stumbled upon a book that made me think, I don't know a single blessed person I could confidently recommend this to. It is so unusual. It's this slim novel called Transfigured Night by Libuše Moníková, translated from German by Anne Posten. It follows this choreographer who left Czechoslovakia and didn't return until after the 1989 Velvet Revolution. And so this woman is walking through Prague and re-experiencing her relationship with what used to be her city. Now, I have to be honest, when I hear the description, a woman takes a walk and has thoughts, my first thought is, no thank you. But there's something so vibrant about this book's mixture of intellectualism and embodied experience. There's a scene where she visits an old classmate, and when I think back on it, it's like I can still smell that apartment. She ends up going in the river at one point, and I remembered the icy feel of that scene. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that the narrator is a choreographer, and so she's used to translating abstract thought into movement, but her dancing thoughts about the cityscape and its history and films and art, they are fascinating in that Ali Smith kind of way of someone who has a serious interest in various forms of art and for whom art is an ever-present part of life. I attended an event with the translator where she said that she pitches projects that go nowhere all the time, and that she was kind of dumbfounded that this was one of the ones that someone took her up on. It makes me feel like there are publishing people out there who are following their noses and are taking charmingly random chances on weird books. I'll talk about this next one quickly because I'm honestly not sure how available it is outside the UK. It's from Small Scottish Press. It's a poetry collection I loved from a Czech poet named Milan Děžinský. It's called A Secret Life, and it was translated by Nathan Fields. I never feel like I end up describing poetry in an appealing way, so I'll leave a poem or two on screen in case that's like more useful for you. But he writes about everyday life, like what it feels like to move through your days, to cook and iron and think about the fact that you're gonna die and that you haven't accomplished what you thought you might by this age. And as you're sitting drinking your tea and contemplating random objects in your kitchen, there are birds flying by your window and hedgehogs building their nests. That's the vibe. One of the lines is, "Desire changes into dinner." I just love that his style is both cerebral and simple. I met Děžinský last year when he came to the States for the Brooklyn Book Festival, and he said that being a poet is his secret life because he's an English teacher at a local school, and his wife and kids couldn't care less that he's this acclaimed writer. So he's just over here minding his own business, quietly processing life through poetry. He's a super smart and very unassuming guy. I just think we probably all need a little more contemporary poetry in our lives. I include myself in that. And these are approachable and playful and at times surprisingly dark poems that I think a lot of people would enjoy. All right, top 3 time. Are you ready? One of those is The Economy of Prestige by James F. English. This was a foundational book for my thesis work because I wrote about literary prizes in the post-communist era. And this is the big daddy, the big text that is always referenced in any later scholarship about cultural prizes. And when I talk about that, I mean things like the Booker Prize, the Pulitzer, the Oscars, any prize for architecture and design and visual art. This does have an academic bent to it. I mean, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu is a big inspiration for English, but he does write in a really digestible way about why we even bother awarding prizes for art. What do we gain from this? What are we trying to achieve? Why do artistic organizations even feel that they need to create these competition-like structures with winners and losers to make the public care? Literary prizes specifically take up a good portion of this book, going back to the early 20th century and the Nobel Prize in Literature and why it was the right format at the right time to become something prestigious. I spent a lot of time with this book and with its academic offshoots, and it was a pleasure. A lot of my other thesis reading wasn't nearly this fun. My favorite novel of the year was Possession by A.S. Byatt. When I talk about this, you should know that I read it with half a brain. I'd wanted to read it for a while, so when school ended and I suddenly had all this time, I was like, let's do this, without really considering that my brain was fried to a crisp. But then I didn't want to stop because it was so good. So good. Analysis. It's about 2 early career academics, a man who specializes in a male Victorian poet and a woman who's familiar with the work of a female Victorian poet. And through a series of pretty dramatic scholarly inquiries, they learn that these 2 people who were assumed to be unconnected actually are connected in a way that shakes the foundations of how both figures are understood. This was my first Byatt, and the brilliance of her mind was overwhelming at times, like overwhelming in the most wonderful way. You get all these interspersed forms in here, diary entries and letters and poetry, a short story, nature writing, which made the reading slower for me because, like I said, my mind wasn't at its most nimble, but I didn't mind having to slow down and readjust because each section created its own kind of momentum so that by the end of it, I was sorry to see that section end. I also talked about this with one of the Czech books that I recommended recently, Kateřina Tučková's The Last Goddess. But I love an archival thriller, a book that makes the discovery of knowledge feel as thrilling as it is. Or maybe these are just the kinds of thrills that I have. Don't know what to make of that. By the last chapter of this, I was quite emotional, especially about the story of the two poets and how that ended. So I think my next Byatt will be The Children's Hour, but let me know if you have other recommendations. And my favorite nonfiction book of 2024 was The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914 by Christopher Clark. And I can now reveal, for the 5 of you who even remember, that in that announcement video, when I referenced preparing something with major history titles, I was talking about an upcoming video comparing books about the outbreak of World War I. This one, which I finished in 2024, and Barbara W. Tuchman's The Guns of August, which I am currently reading. On Clark's book, I'll just say for now that I've wanted to read this for close to 7 years. It has been at the top of my nonfiction TBR for a long time. And when that's the case, and when you've been building something up in your own mind, it can set you up for disappointment. We've all been there. But I enjoyed the hell out of this. It is rigorous and thought-provoking as all get out. At a Christmas gathering, I made a beeline for my uncle in his 70s because I was like, I know exactly who will care about my World War I book. This is one of those times when I feel lucky to be making a video because it requires me to really think through what it is that makes the book great and then to try to communicate that. And I don't have a lot of momentum with the channel yet, so I know that like 700 people will ever click on this nonfiction video, and of those, maybe 85 will watch through to the end. But those 85 people and I are gonna have a great time. I really hope to get back into the swing of things this year and to figure out what my reading life looks like after so many personal and professional changes. And I have some cool channel plans for 2025, if I do say so myself. Thank you for watching. Thank you. And I'll see you soon for another video.